Hi, welcome to Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts, where our experts answer your question. Happy to have two good experts with me today. I've got Dr. Bob Larson from Kansas State
Hey, Brad.
and Dr. Blaine Johnson, who's just completed his PhD and is currently at Kansas State. Will be moving on to Texas Tech. Hey, Blaine.
Hey, how's it going?
So happy to have you guys here because we've got a great question that will actually tie right into some of the stuff that both of you have worked on. Because we had a question from a listener that asked, they were at a meeting, saw some information on heart disease in cattle, and wanted to know how frequently does that happen? What type of cattle does it affect? What are some of the clinical signs that you might see? And Blaine, I'm going to start with you and have you give us a little bit of an overview on heart disease.
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer with how frequently does it happen. And from our data, from what we found, cattle die from heart disease on average about 7 and 10,000 head received. The type of cattle that are dying from heart disease, we couldn't limit that in our data, so it was kind of all inclusive. So we saw all sorts of cattle that seemed to be dying from heart disease. And when they were dying from heart disease, that's probably the big one that everybody's been asking. And from what we were looking at, it appears that cattle are dying from heart disease throughout the whole feeding period. So, I mean, it could be as early as day one on feed and as late as the last day before they load up on the truck.
Excellent. Bob, tell us a little about the clinical signs or what you might expect.
Yeah, so with heart disease in cattle, basically by definition, the heart isn't moving blood as well as it should.
Oh, that's
right.
a good answer, Bob.
So
I'm
there
going
you
to write
go.
that down for points.
You do write that down. So one of the ways that might show up is that the kind of fluid builds up in some of the lower areas of the cattle. So their brisket becomes swollen and enlarged, and that's the classic brisket disease that can be associated with heart disease. Now, I think Blaine's work would show that not all cattle show that sign, but when they have that, that's a pretty good indication that there's a problem with the heart moving blood sufficiently.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that you talked about the frequency, Blaine, but this is certainly an area of emphasis for the industry. What are some of the impacts that you see of heart disease or maybe potential causes? Because you talked about some things that we don't know. Do we have a cause narrowed down?
Unfortunately, I don't have any smoking gun for a cause with heart disease. Our associations that we found from the data, there was a few significant, but unfortunately, it was nothing that was predominantly the cause that we could really find a high group or cluster of cattle that were dying from heart disease. So it's still not very well understood from that aspect of what's causing it. I know there's a lot of speculations and current research going on with genetics into heart disease and some promising data in that direction. But encompassing all of heart disease, I'm not sure even that addresses the overall question of what's causing heart disease.
Excellent. Bob, do you have any additions?
Well, the one other thing that Blaine's research did identify is it appears that respiratory disease or pneumonia and heart disease are somewhat related, but we're not exactly sure what that relationship is because you asked earlier about clinical signs. Well, a calf that has heart failure is not moving oxygen as well, so he's going to show some of the same signs as a calf with pneumonia. So when we say in our records, well, the calves that died of heart disease were also treated for pneumonia, did they truly have pneumonia that damaged the lung that then made it harder for the heart to work, or did they never have pneumonia in the first place? They just had signs that could have been pneumonia or could have been heart disease. And because we're using just regular production records from a feedlot, we can't really tease that apart. But I think that's a good question to dig into more with the next grad student.
Yeah, so it could be clinical signs of heart disease that we're seeing, or it could be clinical signs of pneumonia.
Yeah, and maybe heart disease is making those cattle more likely to get pneumonia. Could be that cattle that have pneumonia are more likely to get heart disease. Or it could be that they're two separate diseases that look just similar. And honestly, I don't think we know at this point.
Okay, absolutely. Any advice you'd give to somebody that's not sure that they have it on their operation as you're thinking about the feedlot side primarily is where we see it, right?
Yeah, my first advice is if we have the opportunity to do a necropsy on any of the cattle that die, I mean, that's one thing we need to do and make sure we know what is causing these cattle to die. And once we can get that well understood, then we can at least collect data on that aspect and start drawing some conclusions if we get enough data. So I think that's the first hurdle is we need to properly diagnose the cattle that are dying and have a good case definition of what we're wanting to try to figure out.
Excellent. Thanks, Blaine, for joining us today. And Blaine ended up with 8 points. Bob, you would have been a lot closer had you not. I asked you what heart disease was, and you said disease of the heart. I'm not going to give you any points for that answer. So, thanks for joining us today, and appreciate, as always, you sending us questions. You can send us more questions at bci@ksu.edu.